that's the effect of the cost allocation realignment that I talked about.
Mhm.
You had to assign, for example, staffing, when we were previously splitting staffing between general electric, water, sewer, let's just say, my position split. And instead of leaving that out there, split specifically into general electric, water, sewer, it all has to be assigned to a home department in order for the cost allocation model to work.
The same reason the projected revenues are such a bump over the next years. It's the exact same.
It's the cost allocation effect. It was the new process we implemented for this year's budget. So it's a realignment. It wasn't an exploding cost factor.
Okay.
This was part of Councilman Fotovich's request for cost allocation. Well, we had an independent
Mhm.
study
Yes, we did.
commission for that, right?
Well, we had a consultant.
Yeah.
So that's what you're seeing, this really big increase in cost is actually this year's realignment plus
Right.
the placeholder.
Mhm.
Which are also reflected within the revenue increases, so that it's truly, at the end of the day, it's a wash. It's not new revenues for the city. The new revenues are the additional tax incomes that we had for the year, plus a few different other pieces.
Which increased valuation.
That the, whatever $1.1 million difference that we see in revenues, they're not nearly an accurate picture of what true revenues for what the city was, not the least.
Except that the expenses follow the revenue. They are,
They have to.
I know they have to. They can be in the same budget year, but they're not. They're in a different budget. I'm just saying. You know, we have our increase in 2014 for the cost allocation piece, and then in 2015, we see the attendant increase in expenditures. Is that correct?
The increase in 15 is partially your staffing.
Mhm. How many individuals did we add to administrative staff for 2015? We have 4 additional staffers?
Total FTE change was 3.
And net gain of 3.
Net gain of 3, yeah. They were all administration. Hmm. One police.
No,
They're all
it was
over.
police,
No,
there was
they're throughout the
community
organization.
development, yeah.
Mhm. Okay.
Again,
And as we discussed also, 15 goes up because of the impact of internal service fund changes.
Okay.
Because a lot of that goes to general fund.
All right. Question number 2. I know that was all in one question, but the second question I've got is with regard to the bonds. Have you talked with Kimmel at Ellers and asked him about the impact of our bond issue if we decide to have a bond issue in 2015, 2016, 2017 for CIP? Will these 2019, 2018 projections negatively impact the market?
I did talk to financial advisor Kimmel today,
Yes.
and I asked him, I showed him this very slide, and I asked him to respond, and it's not the projections in the out years that he was concerned about. I actually wrote notes on what he said. Because that far out is just that, projections. They're going to be more, he says, they're going to be more interested in the consistent message that the governing body delivers. And they noted our planning for strategic goals, and that we told them in our last bond issue that we were getting ready to do a CIP program.
Mm-hmm.
So they gave us high marks for planning. So he does not particularly see that as much as what is, well, I'll tell you what he said, because you asked.
Mm-hmm.
He said, what is the message for a reduction in revenue? How does that go with your 4 strategic goals? And he said that will be the question that S&P will ask us to explain. If you reduce revenues, how does that impact your ability to implement the four goals that you've noted?
Just because there's a reduction in the mill levy doesn't mean there's a reduction in revenues. I mean, I think that that's not necessarily
I think,
a good assumption.
well, I think their assumption would be the mill levy is the one piece of revenue that you do have control over. So by lowering the mill levy, it looks to them that if everything remains at the level it is this year, because you can't anticipate revenue, though we can project for it, you can't guarantee that. But they look at it and says, if nothing changes, they'll make less money last year, they'll bring in less revenues to fund CIP projects that are already unfunded, to maintain their current level of debt and tackle other projects, and that's the control element that we had. That's just what I think they'll probably be looking at there. This is the one time that they could control it, because you can't anticipate sales taxes going up, you hope for it. You can't anticipate property levels going up, but you certainly hope for it. But at the end of the day, you can't control that piece of it. So that would be how I would interpret it. Obviously, I didn't have the conversation, but that sounds to me from the feedback we've gotten, what they're looking at with that piece.
And he didn't solve that answer. I mean, he did not give an answer. He said that's the question that he thinks they will ask. He did not offer, because obviously that's all a policy decision. That's not for me to decide or for him to decide. He's just asking, if I just asked the very question that Councilman Shute asked me.
And I appreciate the feedback, and I'm glad that Mr. Kimmel's weighed in on it. I was very interested in knowing what his analysis was.
Real quick, I want to just check, see if there's anybody else that's got questions. I know that it appears that you've got more, but is there anybody else in the governing body with questions?
I guess, I don't have questions. I guess for me, it really boils down to the $235,000, which, the only thing I didn't agree with was the youth program, but other than that, I was in support of. I personally believe that money, could be better spent on some capital projects. There's a couple specifically that would cover the traffic signal at Lincoln and Midlight, which we've heard, at least I personally have heard quite a bit about, as well as the low water bridges over at the Greenway. Another thing that I've heard from quite a few residents about. So that's my kind of debate with myself, is where that money is better spent. So.
No, and that's a lot of what it came down to for me. The thing that I kept coming back from the exercise at the last meeting was, we were cutting one-time expenses in an effort to create the perception of long-term savings, which simply isn't the case. Because, and I know you're shaking your head, Steve, but the reason to reduce the mill levy, and the equation was, let's reduce costs to equal that mill levy decrease, which is what we've done, but we've only really reduced costs through that proposed mill levy decrease for a single year. And we didn't reduce any services. We haven't reduced anything that has actually a permanent cost upon the city as an expenditure. So what happens is you don't recover that. You can't cut those same programs again. So that's what it comes back to for me. But, and just like what Christie said, if we're reallocating the way that those monies should be spent, because we do have a huge need for different projects in the city. I mean, it could have been as simple as looking at the capital improvement fund itself that we've talked about for years, of actually funding to be able to do these. Those revenues could have been allocated there and taken, in the course of 1 year, a $20,000 reserve fund to $250,000. And, I wish Larry were here, because what Larry always loves to break these down to is how many manhole covers will that buy. That's his trigger right there, is how many manhole covers that can be buy, because David talked at some point about the savings that can come from it. Well, that's a lot of manholes if that's what your project needs to be. So that's been my concern, is one-time cuts don't create long-term savings unless they're service-related, which isn't what we did in the lease. That's not what we did at all. We didn't accomplish that in any way. So, and then it just got put into two issues. I mean, it truly should have been a separate issue. A mill decrease and taxation is completely separate from the cutting of what was perceived to be optional expenses. But it all got balled together, and that's how let's just say, the consensus was able to make that a more relevant conversation for discussion. So, because they had a number to wrap it around, but looking at the wrong number. Now, that's not to say there's not some things within here that we do need to address. We've got rising legal costs. We've got a huge increase that are part of just outside services. We've seen that in every way, and those are things that we need to discuss and find out how often that is applicable, and maybe that's one of the things we ask staff to review through the course of the year, is how many of these dollars are ways we could find a way to do them in-house. What would be the cost to do them in-house from a personnel perspective, if that means we need to hire a different skill set to offset some of these expenditures. We may have, if we looked at that, we may have a core